Yeah, I'm pretty sure this stream is labeled wrong. Life is tough. This is an open historic map stream and not a Zwift stream, as is my normal practice on Saturdays at noon. For some reason, my phone doesn't think that I'm live streaming yet. There we go. Now we are live streaming. Okay then. So, what I had originally thought I was going to be doing in today's stream was more historical than mapping. But, circumstances intervened and I discovered that I didn't know nearly as much about my subject as I thought I did. And decided that, streaming a video about it at my current level of knowledge was problematic. So here we are. The area of interest is colonial and pre-colonial periods in upstate New York. And while I have a decent enough mental outline of the long fight between the British and the French, the French and Indian Wars, plural, spanned 100 years in parallel with the 100 Years' Wars in Europe between the same two powers. And there were 4 hot wars in this period, the last of which is the French and Indian War that George Washington participated in, and that led to the French being evicted from Canada, and really the French being evicted from everything east of the Mississippi River. There are a lot of artifacts of this period, historical and archaeological, scattered through upstate New York. This was where a lot of the fighting went on. But the thing that came up was that I didn't really have a very good picture at all of the native peoples of the area and the details of their relationships with the French and the English, and the nature of their participation. And so I started doing some work to understand, in particular, the tribes that we commonly refer to as the Iroquois. Although that's not the name that they used for themselves. I'm not sure if I can pronounce this correctly or not. The Haudenosaunee, or something like that, is what they called themselves. The name Iroquois seems to have been derived by the French from an insult from a competing tribe, whether that was the Algonquin or the Huron. There seems to be some confusion about which tribe actually contributed the term Iroquois, which means snake. The Iroquois, that is to say the Haudenosaunee, that meant people of the longhouse, because they lived in longhouses that they constructed through the winter. And that people, you see, cover upstate New York from Lake Champlain, Lake George, and the Hudson, all the way across New York State until you get to the Seneca Tribe. The Seneca is actually one of the Iroquois tribes. The Iroquois Confederacy was the union of first 5 tribes, then a 6th tribe, which became a participant. This was their association with each other came from the fact that their tribal lands were adjacent and they shared a language family. There were many more tribes in this language family, even including the Cherokee, who are down in North Carolina and Tennessee. But the five in New York State are the ones that formed a confederacy and agreed not to fight each other anymore, but to be ruled by a overall council. So we have the Mohawk tribe, which was the easternmost, and they're running from the Champlain and the Hudson west to approximately the location of Rome, New York, maybe a little bit closer to Utica. Then we have the Oneida tribe, and we see here that their boundary on the west encapsulates about 2/3 of Oneida Lake. So what they actually cover is the area from Rome and the Great Carrying Place, or the Oneida Carry, where you could get from the Mohawk River to Wood Creek, and Wood Creek would then drain into Lake Oneida, and that became the route of the Erie Canal. To some degree, the Erie Canal would go south of Oneida Lake into Syracuse. Then we get the Onondaga people, and you see how these are shaping up as kind of vertical bands at approximately the same latitude. The Cayuga people, and that would include Lake Cayuga. And then the Seneca people, and that includes the modern Lake Seneca, and it extends, doesn't go all the way to modern Buffalo, but then they're surrounded by other tribes, the Erie. So this map is one that Jeff Meyer brought to my attention. It is a very cool, detailed map of the approximate boundaries of the territories of native peoples. It's important to emphasize approximate boundaries because modern boundary concepts and modern surveying were not things for them. So the issue is really that there are limits to what kind of detail and precision can ever be accomplished with these boundaries. And they were a little bit fluid as various native tribes were in competition with each other. So they won't have been in the same place for extended periods of time. Now, another thing to point out here is down here. This, I'll move it to the center, this small area would become the area of the Tuscarora people, who were a Iroquois speaking tribe from that language family who moved north under pressure, settled in the Confederation area, and became the 6th member of the Confederation. And so you can see here where they're sort of sitting straddled across Onondaga and Oneida land towards the south of that area. So at some level, a lot of the work on native borders is already done here. And even better than that, this is published under a CC0 license. So this seems like a pretty effective way to get native borders into OpenHistoricalMap. We do have some things we've got to think about and talk about. One of the most important things we got to talk about is that OpenStreetMap borders, which is the tagging scheme we have for borders, is the expectation of accurate surveying and, precise agreement, and then you get into this challenge of, well, how do we mirror disputed areas? I mean, what do we do when Russia invades Crimea, takes it, annexes it, and declares it part of Russia? And how do we reflect the fact that this is a disputed claim in an open data project where partisans of either side are going to likely want to go put it back to represent their claim? And the good news is that there aren't active partisans of these tribes really trying to refight a battle from the 16 and 1700s in the map today. On the other hand, the real issue, the thing that makes it hard, is that OpenStreetMap border language right now, the OpenStreetMap tagging schemes don't really address a lot of stuff. And so, right at the moment, there's a dialogue in OpenHistoricalMap about what we need to do to expand the border tagging scheme to cover the things that come up. And so I'm not rushing to import any of these borders, even though I very much would like to, simply because right this minute I really don't know what we're going to be doing with tagging, because the other important thing is that we need to agree on a tagging scheme, and then we need to come up with a appropriate implementation for the rendering engine. And that work basically isn't done yet, so no rush to put these borders in, because it's not going to be that much we can do with them. But the other interesting challenge is that we need to look at these and say, well, these are borders in, say, 1650, 1700, 1750, colonial period. So we can come look at this map, which is off of Wikipedia, and it is a fair representation of New France as the French saw it, which is the blue area here. And obviously this is going to overlap the native lands, even while the natives lived in these places and believed that that was their place. There were never a lot of French settlers in New France. The French would build lots of outposts. There would be some settlers in Montreal and Quebec City, Troy Rivera, and so forth. There would be outposts really up through the Mississippi Basin and out on the Missouri. But just outposts. Primarily the French profit from New France was in fur trading. The British, by comparison, were bringing lots and lots of settlers into the colonies that they controlled. So we see all of Maine, all of New Hampshire, all of Vermont, about half of modern New York, 2/3 of modern Pennsylvania, all of the colony of Virginia, which consisted of West Virginia and Virginia, most of North Carolina, most of South Carolina, a bit of Georgia. These were firmly under British control. There were still natives, of course, living in these areas, but they were getting pressed out under heavy settlement pressure. So that's the first thing we have to do, is recognize that these were areas that are known to have been controlled by French and British. We also see that these purple territories are places that the French claimed, but that they ceded to Britain after losing one of the wars. We see the Spanish actually holding on to Florida, much of Texas, all of New Mexico, all of Arizona. Of course, none of these states had those names yet. And there was basically no English-speaking peoples in these areas that corresponded to French and Spanish Texas. One of the reasons why the French were able to get so much in the way of outposts out here was that they had New Orleans, they had access to the whole of the Mississippi Basin, they had rivers that they could follow west and east into these areas. Although the St. Lawrence was difficult to navigate in this period, it still gave the French access to the Great Lakes. So, during this battle for colonial control, the French had some distinct advantages, but ultimately they lacked the settler population and they lacked the will to hold on to it against the British. By the time of the final French and Indian War, the British had 2 orders of magnitude more settlers in North America than the French. And the French never shipped over a proper French army where the British did, and that was why things ended the way they did. Now I'm showing areas of control. The other thing we got to talk about is areas that are claimed, because of course with all the colonies on the coast, the colonies claimed areas projecting west almost to the Mississippi, maybe to the Mississippi in some cases. So North Carolina thought they included Tennessee, Virginia, of course, assumed that they controlled into Kentucky, Pennsylvania into Ohio. So that's another interesting issue with borders, is this business of, claims versus control. And so that's another thing that our border scheme for OpenHistoricMap probably ought to deal with. I am keeping an eye on Twitch chat over here on my phone. And so that's a rough outline of some of the complexity of border issues. The main place these are being talked about is on a GitHub ticket in OpenHistoricalMap GitHub. And I will, when I upload this video to YouTube later, I will stick a link to that GitHub ticket in the description, so that if you have a GitHub account and you're interested in this issue, you can go read the comments and maybe even make a comment. So what we want to do right now in OpenHistoricalMap, or what I want to do right now, because you may not agree with what you want to do, but this is my live stream. I want to go look at Lake Champlain and talk about Lake Champlain, because this is one of the areas that the French and the British fought over. And what it is basically a glacial lake that connects up to the St. Lawrence and runs north-south, fairly wide in spots, narrower in others. It was a nice level place where boats could travel. Down at the, okay, so this area, that's Lake George. This is where Fort Ticonderoga was located. It's deceptive because it looks like the water connects up easily, but actually there is, I think, a 500-foot drop from Lake George to Lake Champlain. So that was actually a portage where they would bring boats up the hill. And then further south still, it's a relatively narrow chunk of lake, but we get down to what's called Whitehall. And Whitehall was a place where Lake Champlain effectively ended. There was a small town there, village named Skeensboro. The name was changed to Whitehall at a later point in time, and nobody's sure why. And this puts us on the Wood Creek line, and the Wood Creek travels south. And eventually you reach the area of Fort Edward just south of Glens Falls. And you see Fort Edward there, and we see Fort Anne there. These were all locations of outposts and trading posts of the colonial period. These were important fortifications during the French and Indian Wars. And by the time of the Revolution and the Saratoga Campaign of 1777. They were wood. They were largely in ruins. So those names were there, but then things happened in those places. But in general, the fortifications were problematic. So I'm looking at this particular spot on Champlain. This is called Crown Point. And there was a history of forts at Crown Point. There were forts built by the French and forts built by the British here. And I didn't really preview imagery to decide what imagery I was going to use for this. Let's bring up Mapbox Satellite first and take a look. So what have we got here? This is the modern bridge across Lake Champlain. And then right here we have the berm of a classical star fort. And there are actually some really good displays in the visitor center here. This is a state park. So the visitor center is down here. They talk a lot about why star forts were the way they were. And it has to do, the short version is that people defending a fort will aim most accurately and fire at the highest volume if all they have to do is fire straight out from the wall that they're standing behind. So the idea behind a star fort is to ensure that there is crossfire through all of these spaces right up against the wall by providing these angles. So people lined up here are shooting straight out. The people on the corners are in a position to shoot down into this space and keep it from becoming a protected spot for troops to prepare to climb. But Crown Point was not the first fort here. This is closer to the lake. This is Fort Frederick, which the French built. And whereas Crown Point, by the way, neither of these are modeled in OpenHistoricalMap today. That will change during this stream. The French built Fort Frederick during a period where they had more control over what was going on in Lake Champlain. And this would be an area of contention of the French and the British for a very long time. I'm just throwing this down. I'm going to switch over to some other imagery. This is basically the ruined foundations of Fort Frederick when the British advance in the final French and Indian War started up Lake Champlain. The French recognized that the British Army was too strong. I got to look up historic tagging here. I am thinking that I do not precisely remember this tagging scheme. I haven't used it that often. Historic places. Fort. Let's see what we get. Name. Let's make sure we spell the name right too. Fort Frederick, New York. With any luck, we'll get a Wikipedia article. Okay, yeah. We're getting the wrong Fort Frederick. There it is, Fort St Frederick. that also means that we have right this instant the Wikipedia link for this guy. And in order to keep it from whining at me, go replace the underscore with a space, and then go get the Wikidata item for this, which is that number starting with a Q. And if this were OpenStreetMap, I would check off that ruins checkbox. But this is OpenHistoricalMap. So what we do instead, we go back to the Wikipedia page. Okay, 1734 through 1759. Start date. Okay. Arguably, I should do something more complicated with life cycle here, because I could show the existing fort during the time that it was active, and then I could show it as ruins today, because it is ruins today. Okay, it looks like something's wrong. Yeah, I'd seen some hint that there were Maxar issues right now. And there are. So no Maxar imagery for us today. So let's see what else we got. Maxar Premium. Let's go take a look at Bing and see what we got there. Lined a little differently. I don't have a good basis for assuming that one or the other is correct. Let's see what we get in Esri. Yeah, Esri and Ma and Bing are in about the same place, so let's just go with those and declare success. So that's Fort St Frederick. When the British marched up in the last French and Indian War, they marched up with a pretty substantial army, and since Fort St Frederick, it was a stone fort, but it was primarily a trading post, and to impress the natives, there was no way it was going to hold out against an army the size of the one the British sent, so they blew it up. And so the British, rather than do anything with the ruins of Fort St Frederick, built Crown Point. And these are the ruins of Crown Point. And this is now a state park, which includes the ruins of both forts. Crown Point is a fort that was built out of timber and dirt, with then a set of stone buildings inside for barracks and stores. It was not active for very long, and we should go find the Wikipedia page for Fort Crown Point, because we're going to want it. So it was built in 1759. in 1773, a chimney fire broke out, spread, burned for the days, and effectively ruined the fort. So it wasn't operational very long, and the British opted not to reconstruct it after the fire. They left a skeleton crew there, and the Americans would take it quickly when the war broke out. And so this is primarily of importance to the story of the Revolution. In that what would happen was that Henry Knox, who was one of Washington's trusted subordinates, who would be in charge of artillery for the Continental Army under Washington, Knox basically came up to Crown Point and to Ticonderoga, which we will look at in a few minutes. And Knox would basically rescue all of the cannon, and then with an enormous amount of effort he would hump them down the Hudson River to the area near Albany, then across the Hudson, and then across the center of Massachusetts, and they would arrive on a hill overlooking Boston, then occupied by the British, and start dumping fire onto the British in the city of Boston and in the harbor, which, you know, the British did not appreciate, and it would force them to evacuate. So this is the outer boundary. Historic fort. Okay, so that's the outer perimeter. Now we'll give it the inner, and then so now I got to remember something else, and I'm not going to, so So there seems to be some confusion about correct tagging. So we'll use building equals barracks. Okay, that's not what I wanted. It's what you get when you try and orthogonalize something that isn't in the expected shape. So let's just delete that and use what I should have used in the first place, which is this building thing that produces correctly shaped buildings. And we'll just go do that over again using a more suitable tool. Ditto. And then change yes to barracks. And I don't think I really will need to necessarily add them to the multi-polygon. I do want to add end date, except I need the correct end date. And start date 59. So there is Fort Crown Point. There are outer works to Crown Point, but I do not know a lot about them, and I'm not going to attempt to deal with that today. So now we're going to go down here. Okay. Got a 504 out of the server. This is where Ticonderoga is. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? I can still do it. We need to put in the Wikipedia tags. And we need to put in the Wikidata tag. And we're going to declare victory. So this right here we're looking at. We're going to zoom out a bit and talk a little bit about historical context of Fort Ticonderoga, which is the name that it's usually known by today. And it's sitting down here at this bend in Lake Champlain. And this area, the fort's right here where the mouse is. Then you have this hill which was named Mount Defiance. And then on the other side you have a somewhat lower hill which is named Mount Independence. And basically what happened in terms of sequence is that this was a stone fort that was bigger than Fort St Frederick, quite a bit bigger. And once again, when the large British army started marching north, the French recognized that they were not going to be able to hold this, so they just basically blew up the magazine and blew the side out of the fort. There was a small garrison in it at the time that the revolution started in 1775. Basically, the real starting point was in Boston, with the immediate reaction of the colonials who were pro-revolution by Lexington and Concord was really the trigger, and a group of colonial forces, militia, and pickup forces, because there wasn't a colonial army at that point, basically came west, and they were able to surprise the British garrison here, because the British garrison had no idea at all that anything had gone down in Massachusetts. And then they went north and they overwhelmed the British garrison at Crown Point. And that led to all kinds of hijinks. And then the main campaign of the Hudson Valley and Lake Champlain was the Saratoga Campaign of 1777. And that's not a subject for today, but basically the British never repaired the French fort, Fort Carillon. They just occupied it with a small garrison, and they were completely unprepared for the arrival of the Americans. The Americans never put adequate force into holding this site. In 1776, it was defended by a small lake fleet that had been built by Benedict Arnold in Skenesborough, which is now Whitehall. So it was not directly attacked in 1776, but when Burgoyne marched south with British, with German mercenaries, and with some native tribes who were allied with the British, it was too big an army for Ticonderoga to properly be defended from with the forces available. And in particularly, famously, there was only enough force that there was a garrison in Fort Ticonderoga. There was one over here on Mount Independence. Mount Defiance was supposed to be too difficult to climb up, although it dominated the position, and so Burgoyne's engineers were able to hack a road to the top. They got a couple of cannon up. Now, cannon of the period on a level battlefield generally thought to have an effective range of about 1 mile. So if you bring a cannon up to a dominating position, and I've been to the top of Mount Defiance, and it's dominating. I mean, the fort is down here, but it's clearly substantially below, a couple hundred feet at least lower than this position, and is 1.2 miles from that spot on Mount Defiance to Ticonderoga. So if you've got pieces whose range is a mile on level ground, and then you give them a couple hundred feet of altitude advantage, then of course they can just start pouring fire onto the fort, and there's not a single thing that the colonials could do about it, because they have the same guns, same ammunition, but they have to aim up, and they don't have the range on that, and that's why dominating positions are important. And so that's why the commander of the colonial forces at Fort Ticonderoga chose to cross the wooden pontoon bridge to Mount Independence, and then collect all the forces and hightail it south. And Congress, who had failed to provide enough force, proceeded to hold hearings about the behavior of the commander, who actually did absolutely the right thing. He saved his troops to fight another day. There was no way in hell they were going to hold Ticonderoga. They were just going to be lost. So what we're going to do is come down here and look at this. We'll look at it after the imagery updates. This is a reconstructed version of Ticonderoga. And I have to confess a certain amount of uncertainty on my part about the accuracy of the reconstruction, but for the time being, we're going to take it for what it's worth. Um, and this is an interesting contrast to the Crown Point site, where there has been no attempt at reconstruction of St. Frederick or of Crown Point. In 1920s, this was essentially a ruin, really more of a pile of rocks than anything else. A lot of building materials had been taken and used for local housing. And the Pell family acquired the property. And you've probably heard of the Pell family, even if you don't know that you've heard of the Pell family. The Pell educational grants are named after a senator who was a member of the Pell family. And they had an interest in history. And in the 20s and 30s, it was considered reasonable to reconstruct these things. And so they actually literally rebuilt Fort Ticonderoga. And so the structure there today is on approximately the same footprint. But is it the same structure? Well, I don't know. It's some of the same stones probably, but in some ways it's a fantasy on what Ticonderoga probably was. Like I say, today we are going to accept it for what it is. A possibly accurate reconstruction of a historical fort. We're going to go ahead and enter it. But there is more research to do here. But having it in the map and knowing its limitations is better than not having it in the map at all. And basically today Fort Ticonderoga is now controlled by a non-profit that the Pell family turned it over to. So it is not under state or federal control, and it's basically run as a historic tourist attraction. It's a busy place. It's some interesting interpretive history is done here. I've been there once. I'll probably go back. When I do my tour of the approaches to the Battle of Saratoga tour, I generally will go up on Mount Defiance and look down at it, but I will not take my tour into Fort Ticonderoga because that can be a black hole for today, and the tour is intended to span a larger area. So what we're going to be doing here, I'm not sure if there is a link to Ticonderoga in the Crown Point, because there could be a C also, and there's a C also, but it doesn't point to Ticonderoga. Okay, 1758, Battle of Carillon. 4,000 French defenders were able to repel an attack by 16,000 British troops. 1779, the British returned, and at that point there was a token French garrison, and they were driven out, and that was when the French blew up the magazine. The Americans took the fort. So the U.S. allowed it to fall into ruin. Okay, the Pell family actually bought it in 1820 and restored it in the early 1900s. So Fort Carillon, 1755. So the British took it in this is when it was actually operational. These are the start dates. And here, so what we do, we duplicate this. Start date. $1755. End date. So that relation reflects the period of French control. And let's get those Wikipedia. And that wiki data tag. I have some confidence in my ability to spell Ticonderoga, which is why I didn't copy and paste the name. Ticonderoga. I should have done these before I started duplicating relations, because they really should appear with all of these. So let's go get Fort Carillon. No, don't duplicate it, edit it. So there we got those tags. Yeah, we want to duplicate this. So starting in and we'll need to do more research here. But we're going to set ruins yes, because it was in fact, oh, we can actually set an end date on that. We know it's sometimes in this interval, somewhere in this interval, that they actually started rebuilding it. So there are 3 forts dating to colonial times. And I can tell you this building wasn't here back then. That's the store and restaurant. Parking lot was not a historical parking lot. Okay, we're zoomed out to a cancel. You got to do a language tag. what I should do is go back to Crown Point and basically do the relation thing so that I can encapsulate when it was active and when it was in ruins. And similarly to Fort St. Frederick. I'll put that on my checklist of things to go back and do later. The main thing is getting them in. And since I don't see any questions, I'm going to close this out. So talk to you later.